In this episode, we're going to try expanding the town's industry. The big question is whether Greenfield's economy can actually scale, or if there's a limit to how far it can go. Up to this point, the town has been growing steadily, but some of the industries we tried earlier haven't worked out the way I expected. So now the goal is to start pushing the town a little harder and see if we can build something that will support long-term growth. If we can find the right industry, Greenfield might finally develop into a self-sustaining town. If not, we may have just discovered the limits of this economy. Before we can start expanding industry, there are a few basic things that need to be taken care of first. The first priority is getting the new granary stocked and making sure the market stalls are properly supplied with food and goods. Without that working correctly, the town simply can't support more people. Markets are what distribute food to the population. And if the supply chain breaks down, new families won't move in and existing residents can start running into shortages. So before building any new housing or expanding the town further, we need to make sure the food supply and market distribution are working the way they should. Only then can we start thinking about scaling the economy. While we wait for the markets to build up their supply, I take care of a few other things around the town. The stone mining camp has completely filled its storage, which means we already have more than enough stone stockpiled for future construction. At this point, there really isn't much reason to keep mining more. So I go ahead and lay off the workers at the stone camp. This frees up a few more people who can be reassigned to other jobs around the town, where labor is needed more. For now, the stone supply should last quite a while, and we can always reopen the mine later if we need more. Now that the market is fully stocked and operating properly, we can finally start expanding the town again. With food and goods moving through the market stalls, it's now possible to support more families. So the next step is to add more housing. One of the ongoing problems in Greenfield has been a shortage of labor during the farming season. By increasing the population, we should be able to bring in more workers and hopefully stabilize the farms during harvest. If this works, it should help reduce the number of crops being left in the fields before winter. Not fully understanding how orchards work in Ostriv yet, I end up making a bit of a mistake here. I decide to place 5 orchards at once, thinking they might become a good long-term industry for the town. While apples can be sold for export, there's a limitation I didn't realize at first. The export opportunity only happens once a year. Unlike industries such as iron or leather, which can generate multiple trade transactions throughout the year, apples only move during that single seasonal export window. That means even if production increases, there's still only one opportunity to sell the product. Another thing I discovered is that dried fruit is not an export item. So turning apples into dried fruit doesn't really help the town economically. It just creates overproduction. Because of that, orchards end up being useful for food supply, but they aren't a good candidate for a scalable industry. After realizing the limitations of the orchard industry, I decide to scale things back a little. I remove 3 of the orchards and keep only a couple running for now. One of the problems is that fruit can spoil if it sits too long, and with only one export opportunity each year, there's some uncertainty about how much of it I'll actually be able to sell. Rather than committing too heavily to an industry I don't fully understand yet, it makes more sense to treat this as an experiment. For now, I'll keep a small amount of production running and see how it behaves over time before deciding whether orchards are worth expanding in the future. Another issue that starts becoming noticeable at this point is transportation. As the town grows and more industries begin operating, moving goods between storage, markets, and production buildings becomes increasingly important. To help with that, I add another cart shed. This will provide additional transport capacity so workers can move resources around the town more efficiently. Without enough carts moving goods between buildings, supplies can easily pile up in one place while other parts of the town run short. Adding the extra cart shed should help keep the flow of materials moving more smoothly. At this point, I decide to take a closer look at the population to see what's really happening with the workforce. The town keeps running into labor shortages, so I open up the population numbers to check the breakdown. What I find is actually pretty surprising. There are 175 adults living in the town, but only 125 of them are working. Add the 15 laborers, and that only gives us about 140 people actually participating in the workforce. So the obvious question becomes, where are the rest? To figure that out, I start checking individual households to see what everyone is doing. And what I discover is something I didn't expect. Quite a few residents have simply decided not to look for work at all. What surprised me even more is that I couldn't immediately see a clear reason for it. Some of these residents simply aren't looking for work at all. It's possible they were unemployed for so long that they eventually stopped searching for jobs. Another possibility is that they only decide to work when they actually need money. Either way, it creates an interesting challenge for the town's economy. Even though the population looks large on paper, the number of people actually participating in the workforce is much smaller than expected. And that makes scaling industry a lot more difficult than it first appears. For now, the best option is to continue growing the population. Bringing in more families should gradually increase the available workforce and help stabilize some of the industries that are struggling to find workers. But this does raise another question. If many of these residents who currently aren't working suddenly decide to enter the workforce later, what happens then? Will there actually be enough jobs available for them? It's one of those balancing challenges in Ostriv. Trying to grow the town without creating either a labor shortage or a large number of unemployed citizens. For now, the plan is to keep expanding and see how the workforce behaves as the town continues to grow. Even though I removed 3 of the orchards for now, I may still come back and add a few more later as the town continues to grow. The main challenge is figuring out how many orchards the town can realistically support without running into spoilage. If production gets too high and the fruit isn't sold or consumed quickly enough, a large portion of it could simply go bad. So at this stage, orchards remain more of an experiment than a fully developed industry. As the population increases and trade opportunities become clearer, it might make sense to expand them again. But for now, I want to be careful not to overproduce. At this point, the town reaches another important milestone. The population has now hit 300 people, and in Ostriv, that's the limit before a church becomes required. Until the church is built, no new families will migrate to the town, which means population growth is now completely frozen. So even if new houses are built, they won't fill with residents until the church is completed. I do move the church up in the construction queue, but I decide to let a few houses finish first before starting construction. Sooner or later, though, the church will have to be built if the town is going to grow beyond this point. One of the things I've been trying to avoid in this town is livestock. Raising cattle and managing barns adds another layer of complexity to the economy. And for this experiment, I was hoping to find an industry that could scale without relying on animals. At this point, though, it's becoming clear that some of the other industries may have limits. There's still one possibility that might scale a little further: potash production. The real question is whether it can support larger growth or if it will eventually run into the same limitations as the other industries. So I decided to give potash a try and see how well it performs as the town continues to expand. One of the interesting things about Ostriv is the level of detail in the construction process. Buildings don't just appear instantly after you place them. Instead, you can actually watch the entire process as workers bring materials to the site and slowly assemble the structure piece by piece. It's a small detail, but it really adds to the atmosphere of the town. Sometimes it's worth just sitting back for a moment and watching the buildings come together as the town continues to grow. With the church now completed, the town can finally move forward again. Since the population had reached the 300-person limit, migration was completely frozen until this building was finished. Now that the church is in place, new families will once again be able to move into the town. That means we can start expanding the population again, bringing in more workers, and hopefully supporting the industries we're trying to develop. For a growing town like this, having enough people is just as important as having the right industries. With the population starting to grow again, it's also a good time to think about the future workforce. Education plays an important role in Ostriv, so I decide to add a second school to the town. This will allow more children to attend school and receive an education as the population continues to expand. As the town grows larger, having enough school capacity becomes important so the next generation is prepared to take on jobs across the different industries. It's a small investment now that should pay off later as the town continues developing. One thing I just noticed while managing the construction queue is how materials are handled when a building is paused. If a construction project is paused, the materials that were assigned to it can end up being taken by other buildings that are still active. That means supplies you thought were reserved for one project might suddenly disappear and be used somewhere else. To avoid that problem, a better approach is to keep the building unpaused, but simply move it lower in the construction queue. That way the materials remain allocated to that building while allowing other higher priority projects to be completed first. One issue that comes up here is something I actually caused earlier in the game. At one point, I disabled textile production and focused only on producing thread. Because of that decision, the hemp that's harvested on the farms continues to be processed into thread, but since the thread is no longer being turned into textiles, everything starts backing up. Eventually, the hemp fills up the farm buildings and the warehouses, creating a storage problem across the supply chain. Now I have to scramble a bit to get textile production going again, so the excess hemp and thread can finally be processed and the storage buildings can free up some space. It's a good example of how changing one step in the production chain can ripple through the entire system if the rest of the chain isn't adjusted with it. One of the things I've been trying to avoid in this town is livestock. Raising cattle and managing barns adds another layer of complexity to the economy. And for this experiment, I was hoping to find an industry that could scale without relying on animals. At this point, though, it's becoming clear that some of the other industries may have limits. There's still one possibility that might scale a little further: potash production. The real question is whether it can support larger growth or if it will eventually run into the same limitations as the other industries. So I decided to give potash a try and see how well it performs as the town continues to expand. If potash is going to become a viable industry for the town, production will need to expand. Looking at the current output and demand, it's clear that the existing setup won't be enough to keep up. At the rate potash is being produced, it looks like the town will need at least 4 production buildings to handle the volume properly. But even then, it's still questionable whether this industry is actually worth the investment. Each potash building requires 6 workers. With 4 buildings running, that's 24 workers in total. At $1 per month per worker, the town is paying about $24 a month in wages, or roughly $288 per year. Potash sells for about $23 per 1,000 units. That means the town would need to export roughly 13,000 potash per year just to cover the labor costs. So while potash might scale somewhat, the real question becomes whether production can reach that level consistently enough to actually turn a profit. At this point, it's time to address another issue in the town. We've been seeing quite a few deaths lately, most likely from sickness spreading through the population. So I decided it's time to bring a doctor into the town. In Ostriv, the doctor also works as a barber and surgeon, providing basic medical care for the residents. With a proper doctor in place, hopefully the town will start seeing fewer deaths and the overall health of the population will improve. As the town continues growing, having access to medical care becomes another important step in keeping everything running smoothly. Since potash production relies on bark and the production of charcoal, the forestry operation becomes an important part of the supply chain. One thing I notice is that the current forestry building is quite a distance away from the ashery. That means workers have to travel a long way just to gather the materials needed for production. To reduce that travel time, I decide to build another forestry building closer to the ashery. By shortening the distance between the forestry operation and the potash production buildings, it should help keep the supply of bark and charcoal flowing more efficiently. Sometimes small adjustments like this can make a big difference in how smoothly an industry operates. At this point, I decide to check the population numbers again to understand what's happening with the workforce. The town now has 219 adults living here. Out of those, 175 people are working regular jobs, and only 4 are available as laborers. That gives us a total workforce of 179 people. But when you compare that to the full adult population, that still leaves about 40 adults who aren't participating in the workforce at all. Meanwhile, there are 7 charcoal piles waiting to be supplied with firewood, yet no one is stepping in to do the job. That's becoming a serious issue because charcoal is needed for several production chains, including the potash industry we're trying to build. Everyone received a raise earlier in the game, so wages shouldn't be the problem. Yet there are still around 40 adults who simply aren't looking for work. At this point, I almost have to wonder, are they on strike? The situation with charcoal is now getting even worse. There are now 10 charcoal piles waiting for firewood, with 2 more only partially supplied. At this point, there is effectively no charcoal being produced anywhere in the town. Without laborers delivering firewood, the entire charcoal production chain has completely stalled. That's becoming a serious problem because several industries rely on charcoal to keep running, including the potash production we were hoping might scale. Until this labor shortage is resolved, this part of the town's economy is essentially at a standstill. At this point, the situation has become serious enough that something needs to change. With charcoal production completely stalled in several industries depending on it, the town can't continue operating like this. The strange thing about this situation is that many of these adults aren't even looking for work. There are jobs available across the town, yet a large number of people simply aren't entering the workforce at all. That's what makes this labor shortage so confusing. On paper, the population looks large enough to support the industries we're trying to build, but in reality, a significant portion of the adults just aren't participating in the workforce. So even though jobs are available, the town still ends up short on labor when it matters most. At this point, it almost feels like the town has plenty of people, but not enough workers. So the only thing I can really think to do is make all of the jobs available again and see if that encourages more people to enter the workforce. If there really are dozens of adults simply not working, opening up every position might finally get some of them moving. Maybe that will break whatever strike seems to be happening in the town and get the laborers back to work. After digging deeper into the population numbers, it started to become clear what was happening. Even though the town showed more than 200 adults, a large number of them were no longer part of the active workforce. Many of the older residents had effectively retired, which meant the actual labor pool was much smaller than the population numbers suggested. That explained why so many industries were struggling to find workers, especially jobs that depended on laborers like hauling firewood for charcoal production. As more houses were built and new families began moving into town, the labor situation slowly started to improve. The newer residents were entering the workforce, which gradually increased the number of available workers. To speed things up a bit, I also try to mass hiring and firing across several workplaces. That forced the game to reshuffle workers and help push more people back into the labor pool. After that adjustment, the situation finally started to stabilize and the town's industries began moving again. After working through the various problems in Greenfield, one of the biggest questions I wanted to answer was whether any single industry could truly scale far enough to support a large town. The answer, at least from this experiment, appears to be no. Most industries eventually run into practical limits. Agricultural products in particular suffer from spoilage, which means they can't simply be stored indefinitely the way industrial goods can. Because of that, farming alone doesn't scale well as the primary economic driver of a large settlement. Even industrial production has limits once transportation, labor, and storage start to become bottlenecks. What seems to work best instead is a combination of industries. When several smaller production chains work together, the town can grow in a much more stable way without relying too heavily on any single resource. Greenfield turned out to be a good example of that balance. While no single industry dominated the economy, the combination of agriculture and light industry was enough to keep the town stable and growing. Of course, there are still limits, and eventually every town begins to feel the pressure of logistics, labor, and storage. But for now, Greenfield has proven that even without livestock or a single dominant industry, a stable town can still be built. If you enjoyed following along with this experiment and the process of figuring out how the town's economy works, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.